Welcome, everyone. My name is Rachel Brown. I'm the Executive Director of Over Zero, and I'm very excited for everyone here to join us for another seminar in our series on countering online hate and its offline consequences. This series is hosted by the Media and Peacebuilding Project at George Washington's School for Media and Public Affairs, as well as Over Zero in partnership with the World Bank. Each seminar in this series covers individual chapters in a forthcoming book on the same topic, countering digital hate and its offline consequences. And our hope for these seminars and for this book more broadly is to merge insights from cross-disciplinary research and global practice to spotlight a spectrum of interventions and broader reforms that can be implemented to mitigate the spread of and offline impact of hate speech in conflict-fragile settings. So for today's seminar, we have a team from Build Up, and the Build Up team will present their chapter, Responses to Polarization Archetypes on Social Media. This chapter focuses on the presentation of online hate signals, the structure and intensity of societal divisions. And it looks at when these seeds of discord are planted, what constitutes a fertile soil to grow and spread. So this will be a very interesting presentation, and we're joined by three members of the Build Up team today. We have Mira Mawla, who's a program management lead at Build Up. She's based in Beirut and brings experience in political and social development, community-based field research, conflict analysis, participatory peace building, and dialogue facilitation. Gichuhi Hawk is a facilitator and process interaction designer who believes learning, networking, dialogue, and relationship healing opportunities can happen in digital spaces. She's the dialogue and learning lead at Build Up and is continuing a decade of combined experience and education in third-party conflict engagement, global education, and youth development. Helena, I'm gonna mess up your name, I'm so sorry, Helena. Puig Laurrari is a governance and peace-building professional with over a decade of experience advising and supporting UN agencies, multilateral organizations, and NGOs working in conflict context and polarized environments. At Build Up, she focuses on the integration of digital technology and innovation to peace processes and on the analysis of digital conflict drivers. And I will also just say she is an early leader in this space of looking at the relationship between technology and conflict. So I will pass it along to the team at Build Up so that they can share about this chapter and how they've worked to understand affective polarization online, as well as the conducive environments that can determine the scale and impacts of online hate. So over to you. And please feel free to put questions into the chat as they're presenting. We'll turn to question and answer after their presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. And hi, everyone. It's good to be here and good to be with you. My name is Gichuhi Hawk, and I'll get us started with an intro of what our chapter is and what it's been about. So our chapter is the Archetypes of Polarization on Social Media. As Rachel kind of introduced, this is centered around knowing that hate speech comes from something. There's lots of metaphors that describe this, whether it's an iceberg and what's beneath the iceberg, or whether it's a seedling and what's underneath the soil, etc. All of these point to the same thing, that we know that hate speech emerges from something and presents itself in these various endogenous forms with different intents to different targets, etc. And so what we aim to do in this chapter is to kind of dig beneath to look at what that something is that it's coming from. And we propose that examining the composition of affective polarization helps us understand what creates a conducive environment for online hate, especially on social media platforms. I want to talk about what I mean by affective polarization first, because you'll hear us refer to it throughout, because it is what this conceptual framework is based on. We're defining affective polarization as a dynamic process intertwined with conflict escalation by which a self-reinforcing spiral cooperates to separate ideologies or identity groups into increasingly distanced and aggregated adversaries. In other words, we think about, when we talk about polarization, it's typically bifurcated into kind of two areas of analysis. One is an issue-based polarization, what topics are polarized, how far apart are people on different topics or issues in terms of their ideological positions. And affective polarization refers more to the relationship. How much animosity do people feel towards others? And that's where the issue and the sort of threat lies in affective polarization, because that's where conflicts are more likely to become intractable. And so that's what we're focusing on here, is the affective polarization. It is a process, not just a snapshot. And so in that way, we think it's best defined by its dynamics, meaning what is happening in a process of affective polarization. And we propose that understanding the links between hate speech and affective polarization specifically provides direction and legitimization for a broader range of counter strategies to hate speech, beyond a response toolbox, which we've observed is now commonly limited to a combination of either content moderation or norm reinforcement. And so we think by looking at affective polarization and all the different entry points that it provides, this offers different, just a broader toolbox for intervening in online hate speech. So our thesis, if you will, and then I'll sum up and introduce the actual archetypes framework, is that we think that this theoretical framework of the archetypes of polarization and their manifesting signals on social media can be used in program design, social media analysis, further research, intervention design, etc. So let me get into it. I wanted to just start by just sharing what the actual framework is. Here it is. We're calling this our archetypes of polarization. The 5 key archetypes are outlined here, and we'll explain these in more detail throughout this presentation. You'll see here that there are attitudes, affiliation, interaction, interests, and norms. And let me just zoom into these middle circles here. So the 5 key archetypes that we have here, explained in these central circles. These central circles are really just a range of contributions from social psychology and applied conflict studies, namely social identity theory, group polarization, prejudice and contact theory, etc. And so these are just like an organization of those existing ideas and research. And I'll just kind of go around the circle to explain briefly. In this first one, attitudes, in this archetype of polarization, this deals with stereotypes, dehumanization, de-individualization, and vilification, where less direct communication between online users leads to less information and knowledge of the other, and biased expectations about the other group increase. Moving to affiliation, this is the creation of cohesive aggregate groups. So the accumulation of parties from formerly neutral, adjacent, or cross-cutting positions into a limited number of camps with increasing in-group cohesion. Third, for interaction, this is the interaction that the quality and quantity of communication lines change or decrease. So the reduction of quantity and deterioration of quality of meaningful communication, where interpersonal relationships, lines of communication, and everyday interaction that are normal to peaceful engagement are cut off. Interests, this is coalesced positions and power. As conflict is escalating, specific issues of contention tend to give way to more general, simplified, and unspecified claims, accompanied by zero-sum thinking and the active pursuit or justified acceptance of centralized group power and influence. And finally, the cherry on top, if you will, is norms. Combative and trust-degrading norms. The formation of new combative norms of interaction displaces empathy or curiosity and reifies the erosion of trust between people and towards representative institutions. This will become even more clear later, but even as we're just introducing it now, you can see that a lot of these things are very interconnected, and it's sort of why it's presented in this wheel. There's a lot of overlap between adjacent sections of the archetypes, but we still think it's useful for analytical and also programming strategies to be able to draw and pull things out and see where the differences lie and how they're interacting with each other. Now the outer circle, zooming back out, this is really our edition to these pre-existing ideas. And this catalogs the most salient signals of these archetypes that we have seen in our work conducting social media analysis and interventions in various contexts. So these are what we call the signals of polarization. And these are the actual observable behaviors that we can see online that we think track within each of these archetypes. Because we think of archetypes as kind of a recurring imitation of an original. And this is a kind of fitting description for the emergent role of social media and existing patterns of polarization, because affective polarization has existed for long before social media was a place where it was happening. It definitely has, human roots. And so these signals of how this is showing up is kind of an imitation or just a new way that these are showing up. So we utilize archetypes to show how these online behaviors are undergirded by these existing polarization patterns and dynamics. And so now we're going to split this up kind of into talking about the top two and the bottom three and the implications that all of that has for countering hate speech.
Yes, thank you, Julie. So I'm going to start with just an overview of the attitudes and the norms, which, as Julie said, were the top two. And as she said, also the overview of talking about all of these five. Of course, there are ways that hate speech kind of intertwines into them, but there's a lot to be said about how attitudes and norms in specific create this fertile environment for hate speech to occur. And I'll explain a little bit more. So in general, in the model that we see, there's a natural home for hate speech as a signal of trust-degrading norms. We know that hate speech is something that is very clear to us, but what is happening online for that to become, an environment where where it's easy for this to happen. Prejudiced attitudes in specific. I'm sorry, I just need to change my, so that I don't lose my connection in a minute. I'm very sorry, 1 second. It's not changing. It's not working. Okay, I'm very scared to.
All right, I guess we'll take a pause unless Julie, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I can carry where she left off. Oh, shoot, she just must have had an internet cut and probably couldn't get on 3G fast enough.
We'll let her back in as soon as she arrives.
Okay, perfect. I'll just carry on where she left off. So she was talking about how norms and attitudes kind of are a natural home and a place that we see a lot of analysis and interventions about hate speech coming through. Oh, looks like she's back.
Yes, just let her back in.
I'm very, very sorry, everyone.
You're good. I was jumping in for you, but then you got back quick. So
okay. So I was saying that so in this model, there's a natural home for hate speech, and we see it actually as a signal. It's not a norm in itself. It's not an attitude in itself. It's a signal of trust-degrading norms and exclusionary or dehumanizing attitudes. So you need to have a foundation of prejudiced attitudes as a prerequisite for someone engaging in hate speech. And prejudiced attitudes are more likely to be expressed or enacted when there is a perceived norm of social acceptability. So we're not only talking about the norms that kind of protrude or the attitudes that protrude outwards from an in-group to an out-group. We also talk about the norms that exist within each group to kind of exacerbate or make the underlying conditions that much more kind of conducive, that much more of a catalyst for hate speech. When interventions focus on hate speech, norms and attitudes are accordingly the lens through which most of this analysis and the design are conducted. And there are significant elements of polarization that give us opportunities to combat the hate speech and also target the underlying conditions that allow it to thrive. I'll give just an example of in past research how we've seen this come up. and especially with attitudes, if we want to delve into attitudes. So we know also from the overview of the wheel when it was in the previous slide, we know that effective polarization, when we look at it from the perspective of attitudes, we know that it includes biased and negative attitudes about an out-group. We have an in-group, we have an out-group. We have fixed and overgeneralized beliefs, notions about certain groups, assumptions about their identities and their intersections. And we usually see this in a polarized network public sphere or social media stream. So we see literal de-individuation, erasing the value of an individual, or referring to an individual as a plural, third-person pronouns, they, this whole community, targeting, speaking to people as a homogenous group, assuming similar ideas, similar positions on issues and similar characteristics as people. Sometimes memes or cartoons can be helpful signals that are very apparent to understand how this dehumanization, for example, is taking place. We have this kind of generalized context of blame, talking about my context's shortcomings, and everything that's happening now from my standpoint, from this outgroup, for example, will be blamed very clearly on another kind of homogenized group. In our past research studying tensions between Lebanese and Syrian refugees online in the Lebanese network public space, we came across a couple of these examples. The first one, translating to English, is a comment from a Lebanese Facebook user saying, well, if you don't like living in Lebanon, so maybe someone, a Syrian in the comments, was kind of lamenting the current conditions for them as a refugee. And the response to this, well, if you all don't like living in Lebanon, show us how strong you are and go back to your idiot, referring to the government, let's say, in general. Why are you still stuck to our country? There's nothing left for you to steal. So again, targeting an individual as if they are kind of responsible for these acts individually, and assigning blame so clearly. And establishing this very polarized atmosphere of the Syrian versus the Lebanese in that dynamic. The second is the power dynamic and the situation is similar, and the comment is, send them to Syria, it's warmer and better there, but they like to stay in Lebanon to earn money from organizations and continue to beg. They are a people who likes humiliation. So, we see from these kinds of posts that certain power dynamics exist amongst groups of polarized users. They, posts like this, and in general, these attitudes, they are symbolic representation of how, offline dynamics could be imbalanced, but also, a reification or a re-emphasis of this host identity and refugee identity, a citizen identity and the identity of the other. These are things that, because of the words, the visualizations that we can see online, they can be very apparent to us in a comment thread like the one copied above. And it's also important to note that it's not only that this behavior can be recognized easily, it's also important to contextualize it. What are the mechanisms, the confirmatory dynamics, what is allowing this archetype to thrive and to expand? And so when we see a continued existence of these attitudes online, what we end up seeing also, along with this polarization that's pulling the outgroup away from the in-group consistently, is a rigidification of the outgroup's identity. And it becomes further more and more unshakable to anyone who is already benefiting from those kind of the norms that already catalyze, this inflation of hate speech, for example. When that's already happening, this rigidification is also happening across time or with time. And then this is making integration, communication, or any peaceful kind of rehumanization of relationships between these two groups. It's making it much, much harder to occur online. And it's also kind of pushing this dynamic farther away from reality because of how inflated this rhetoric could get. So I'll take the next slide to go forward to norms. Sorry. So to talk now about norms as a different, archetype in itself, I think when Julie said cherry on top, when she was presenting the five, I thought about it very much as that when we were first kind of thinking through these five archetypes, because the norms, combative norms online are also kind of setting the stage for how communication has happened online, or has tended to happen increasingly online. Most recently, I mean, since we started looking at something called conflict online, digital peace building, or polarization, the first thing that kind of becomes apparent is the fact that combative norms are kind of normalized. The way that we speak to each other online is just kind of representative of some kind of erosion of trust, shying away from civility whenever we can, these kinds of things. I don't want to generalize, but it's just, it kind of overwhelms us when we want to talk about archetypes as something we kind of single out. We know very much also that in-groups and out-groups have always existed for sure, but combative norms in themselves really create the conducive environment. They're there no matter what archetype we're studying usually. So yes, this rigidification that I was talking about before, that comes also from attitudes. Norms are exacerbated, or combative norms that lead to severe actions against the other online, or new rhetoric, newly reinforced discourses online. These are all things that are very much, the combative norms that we see catalyze this. So also, like, when others see that that this rhetoric is starting to become normalized, the nature of how people speak to each other, it only ends up reinforcing defensive, apathetic, also competitive norms for interaction. This was very much also in the background in what we saw in the slide above. This competition of resources, of who's stealing what from whom, etc. And so for signals of this archetype, we can do something as simple as, searching key terms that we know are used in certain contexts. How are people taking positions on things? Are people doxing, trolling, harassing others, using combative and harsh tactics? How much is this mistrust becoming apparent? These are things we usually try to pick up when we look for signals. So I'll move to the next thing. So we know that, regulation, digital literacy, content moderation, they are the most common interventions when we decide to address digital conflict drivers. We talked a lot now about how we identify these behaviors online, how it can be easy to look up something like hate speech or track a behavior online that seems to be, for example, stereotyping or dehumanizing an out group. So how do we address this as a conflict driver, or a driver of digital conflict? We know that we feel some kind of urgency when it comes to regulating content, erasing lexicons of terms that we could be, really sensitive to seeing, or we don't want people to see them. This is our instinct. And we have this urge to diagnose and preempt and mitigate the negative effects of the hate speech that we see. And so for that reason, and because we have things like, I don't know, tools that we can use just a term to search something and it comes up, we see that it feels doable. But we have to keep remembering that anything that we choose to regulate, anything we choose to educate people on, any content we choose to moderate, we have to contextualize it in a certain time space, a certain temporality that also has its own power dynamics. So we can just like doing this can make way for interventions that can ease polarization, that can ameliorate certain harmful conditions that we see online. We also know that seeing such terms, for one person it's hate speech, for the other it's a chance to finally see that a certain lexicon is being used. For example, for someone conservative, an LGBTQ adjacent term could be something similar to hate speech, whereas for others, it's something that needs to be talked about and should be kind of addressed in that way. So it's just to say, to contextualize this is important, and to not always just take it at face value that all of so much of this language can be harmful just by virtue of it being online. And this comes to the second point, which is that understanding polarization as cultural practice makes us take a step back and say, it's not just about the fact that we have differing opinions. It's about those norms that are happening. It's about the culture of how the dialogue is happening online, to differentiate kind of between what is the healthy conversation to have, what is the engagement that might bring people closer together, and then what is that polarization that's actually destructive. So to kind of move away a bit from that binary of this is acceptable speech and this is absolutely not acceptable, especially since we know so much about how hate speech has been kind of exclusively pushed out as a main action point and as the worst thing that can happen in the online space. So yeah, like this is just to finish on that last note of complexifying, whether it's just as simple as, this is unacceptable language. Let's figure out how to kind of filter it out of the online spaces that we're seeing. For example, the word queer, as I was saying earlier, is or isn't hate speech depending on how it's practiced. Certain things that have been slurs to others are now being reclaimed by certain in or out groups, depending on where you're standing. And these need to be conducive to an environment that creates possibly less hate speech, less combative norms, less rigidification, rather than treating it like a zero sum in that way, if that makes sense. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Mira. So I'm going to be taking over for the last three, or the bottom three archetypes in this wheel, and just to connect it to this last point that Mira was making about this critical distinction that we want to highlight in between how issue-based polarization becomes effective and intractable when we can't change what we think or say without losing core social networks or identities. I think that these three remaining archetypes of polarization highlight these areas of polarization as cultural practice that are often overlooked in conversations about hate speech. And by examining these core areas of practice in digital culture, we think they contribute to understanding the motivations and the incentives behind effective polarization. So you'll see that there are three of them, as Julie said at the beginning: affiliation, interaction, and interest. So let me talk a little bit about each of them. And then I'll just say something about how that all kind of comes together into an understanding of what's happening here. So when we talk about affiliation, affiliation is a fairly easily recognizable archetype of polarization, where parties are pulled in a magnetic sense towards poles of a number of limited aggregate groups that frame and define a conflict. So it can be Republicans and Democrats in the US, it can be political parties and ethnic groupings in Kenya, it can be sectarian and religious alignments in Lebanon, just to use the three contexts that we've been looking at in more depth. And despite wider societal losses of social cohesion, group members experience increased homogeneity and cohesiveness within the group as the bonds within the group become stronger and cross-cutting memberships deteriorate. So you're sort of not getting any of the crossover that you would get across communities. And this kind of sort of community affiliation and polarization is what underlines a transformation from the few to many, which is a hallmark of conflict escalation and forms the basis for any kind of persistent or intractable conflict. So often what happens in these situations is that people that were in positions to hold moderating or mediating roles are silenced or pulled out of their bridging positions. And this dynamic that we know, from offline interactions is being amplified on social media with in-group validation and a spiral of silence, which you can see some of the signals that we've identified on the wheel there. And then if we move along to interaction, the interaction archetype is kind of a natural parallel to more salient group affiliation and negative perceptions of the other. A way to think about it is that as the structural middle falls out of a communication ecosystem, the lines of communication and everyday interaction that are normal to peaceful engagement are cut off. So there's a reduction in both the quantity and the quality of conversation. And there are, there's increasingly more closed spaces. There are some features and functionalities embedded in social media platforms that can signal a breakdown in meaningful engagement. These functionalities are used as visible and invisible strategies by social media users in a polarized context as a way of either managing divergent viewpoints or kind of other interactions. So it can also be unfriending or unfollowing users with different ways, unsubscribing from certain services, blocking or restricting specific content or users or organizations, self-censorship on sensitive topics. So we see this in many different ways in the space of social media in particular, and how that affects interactions. And then continuing to move along, we have the archetype of interests. And if we're seeing that interaction across difference is difficult, it's probably, in a way, it's because if there weren't real interests at stake, then it might not be so difficult. In the interest archetype, specific issues of contention tend to give way to more general, simplified, and unspecified claims that lead to this kind of zero-sum thinking that Mira was also referring to, and the active pursuit or the sort of justified acceptance of centralized group power and influence. So in other words, there's the strength in numbers, and people have legitimate aims for change, encouraging a pursuit of power using kind of coalesced positions, so the interests become fewer. This kind of zero-sum thinking paired with the other archetypes in this bottom part around negative perceptual changes, which is the affiliation one, and reduced interpersonal ties, which is the interaction one, give justified motivation to power seeking through harsher tactics in the name of a greater good. And if this is sounding familiar to a lot of the content that you see on social media, it's because we really see these coming out very clearly in a lot of social media interactions. Do you want to move on to the next slide, Julie?
And just to note, take 5 to 10 more minutes so we leave enough time for discussion. I'm sure people have lots of questions.
Okay. So I'll wrap this slide up quite quickly. So the archetypes of affiliation, interaction, and interest really enable us to further understand what is motivating the use of hate speech and contributing to what makes it accepted or even gainful to use. So basically, it's kind of like the ground on which hate speech is growing. I mean, I don't need to kind of label this point. I labor this point. I think it's quite clear what we're looking at. I think the one point that I do want to make is that there are some people who may come to social media with pre-existing networks and an intent to spread hate. But there are many others who come onto social media to play video games or to meet people or to find old acquaintances. And yet they go through a radicalization process that these archetypes try to outline, with the noted amplification that the architectures and affordances of social media platforms supply. And that means that they may end up spreading hate as a result of this process of effective polarization that we see on social media. Can I have the next slide? So I think the question we wanted to leave you with is can the wheel turn the other way? Effective polarization creates destructive relational spirals. So can depolarization and social cohesion initiatives create constructive spirals on social media? And we think yes, and Julie's going to tell you very quickly about some recommendations for application.
Okay, cool. So our optimistic yes isn't based on nothing. It's based on kind of a long history of peace building interventions and also ways that we've seen it work. I just wanted to conclude with sort of 3 overarching recommendations that come in. But first, I just want to flag that this is quite an unprecedented phenomenon where we can look at conflict contexts in the US and Lebanon and Kenya as we kind of dived deeper in this chapter too. And there's a notable level of commonalities in both sort of analysis and intervention, which I think adds new dimensions and questions to, you know, what is local peace building and the commonalities across the context, just based on the fact that our conflict contexts now share a common space, these common platforms, and these platforms have the same architecture and affordances, you know, whether they're here in the US or Kenya. And so we see the same types of signals coming through and have kind of a fixed menu of intervention tools if you are choosing to intervene on social media. You know, depending on the platform, that's some menu of ads, analysis, targeting, messaging, you know, there's a fixed menu depending on the platform, which I think is quite interesting. So what we found is that fighting polarization online is kind of a global concern, and the nature of the problem engenders shared solutions just based on the fact that we have this common shared conflict space now. So some 3 overarching recommendations, just to be really brief, and then we can have more discussion. One is just engage with the signal. We have an exceptional amount of tools now that we can, we have lexicons, we have analysis capabilities that we can find hate speech quite easily. And so in this one, we're asking, you know, instead of maybe the impulse and the justified need to moderate content, can we also find those signals and then engage with them, not just bury the signal, if you will? And because those are signaling these deeper societal divisions that we can then use to create projects that respond to those in a different, broader ways. And maybe in discussion, we can share some examples of organizations that we know are doing that. A second recommendation is to enlist embedded interveners in community and support. This is recognizing that while the architectures of our social media platforms and conflict contexts are common, interventions still diverge based on different contexts. And it kind of becomes even, I don't know, even more important, because it has an added dimension of importance, because the communication and engagement on social media is based on nuance and metaphors and shorthands and daily changing contexts in a way that having someone embedded there who is doing intervening is just incredibly important, and adds another added dimension that it's not just enough to be me, Julie Hawk, in the US, but if I'm intervening on Twitter, for example, there's an extra level of credibility needed of me having an existing account or, you know, whatever. So you have to both sort of be embedded in the physical context and have credibility and embeddedness in the online context as well for intervention. Again, maybe some examples can come out in discussion. And just finally, like a final recommendation is to mainstream digital peace building or mainstream digital responses, if you will, because we think that we can't really divorce on and offline influence anymore. Online is affecting offline, offline is affecting online. And so our hope is that any intervention that aims to tackle hate speech just keeps that sort of holistic notion in mind, that if intervening in an offline way or in a hybrid way, just that the online is always considered as another, you know, potential entry point, and sometimes an entry point that has more strategic advantage for different ways, just based on what's possible with social media. Again, we have some examples we could share with that. I think that's it, Rachel.
Great. Thank you all so much for this presentation. And I'd love to open it up now. I know we have a lot of different participants. If you could raise your hand or put a question in the chat, then I will manage. But maybe as we wait, for questions to come in. Something I'd love to ask you to talk a little bit more about is the way in which understanding these archetypes helps pinpoint us towards different intervention design, because I know that this is not just a tool for analysis as you're using and thinking about it, but also for action. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, maybe I can start and then you guys jump in if you want to. So I think, one thing is, as we're kind of rambling around a lot, we've been really in the weeds writing this chapter. But one thing that we hope we made clear is that we see the most sort of common form of intervention towards hate speech being either around moderation, regulation, or education, which are all really good things. But I think what this broader view of what underlies hate speech says that interventions could also focus on, maybe more traditional peace building strategies around intergroup contact and changed affiliations and addressing real interests, and that all of those things contribute to hate speech and can be used as entry points to like address it in a more indirect way. I wonder if Helena and Mira, if you wanted to add anything else. And I'm specifically thinking, Helena, maybe if you wanted to just flag the Yemen teams and how they sort of use the signal.
Yeah, I was just looking for my notes on that, and I think that so we've been supporting these three organizations working in Yemen to do some analysis of the social media discourse, particularly around identity, basically group-based identity. And what they found is that there was a prevalence of coordinated harassment and back attacks, so basically exclusion from the group based on identity on social media, and that it was for us that sits in the archetype around norms. So basically, there's been this norm created on Yemeni social media around that, and specifically when they were looking at the retweet network. They were seeing these three very clear poles representing the three conflicting parties. And there were relatively kind of homogenous subnetworks with discourse that was directed exclusively at that same group, with repeated patterns of content sharing by the same group. And it included lots of negative comments and hate speech on accounts, especially on posts that talk about the group. But when they identified kind of this norm, this pervasiveness of this norm, they've done three very different interventions that are not about education or moderation directly. One team is running a narrative change campaign to counter hate speech by offering a view that highlights the peaceful coexistence between North and South before the conflict started. Another team is running an awareness raising campaign on hate speech and its impact on society. And the third team is focusing its content on sharing people's experience of hate speech. So these are all much more focused on norm shifting than necessarily on content moderation per se. And I know that that's nuanced, but I think it's that kind of nuance that we're looking for with this analysis.
Great. We have a few questions coming into the chat, so I'll just take them in order. The first is, or Babak, did you want to? I'll just share them. So the first is, how do you see your model coming into play in the current Ukraine conflict? And could some of the recommendations you put forward now be used now to diffuse drivers of this particular conflict?
Do you want me to have a go at that?
Yeah, please. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think it's interesting that you're asking us about Ukraine, because I know it's top of mind for everybody right now. But I think in a similar way that with any offline intervention, we would probably say right now is not the time for peace building in Ukraine, that we're at the wrong stage in the conflict for peace building interventions to be central to a response in the Ukraine. I have a similar reaction to this. I think right now what is really important in Ukraine is actually to combat the spread of dis and misinformation and its direct harm to civilians. And that's because of the stage of the conflict we're at. But Julie, I'm interested to hear we haven't spoken about this internally, so you might have a different idea on that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I haven't really thought about it, to be honest. Top of mind, just based on the stage of conflict, I think like the salience of an archetype would change. I think right now interest is key. And, we are seeing sort of coordinated state-run and not non-state-run campaigns, if you will, to spread hate speech or spread disinformation and misinformation, etc. And these are really coordinated because of interests, because of their placement in the conflict or whatever. And so I would say, we've often talked about how it'd be interesting to use this sort of framework to kind of almost make a spider chart for what is most salient in a context now, and based on that could focus interventions in that direction. So maybe attitudes and affiliation, are less important now, but interests and norms, are key. And so that's where interventions are focused. And in a different context, that would be shifted in different ways. And we've kind of done like some preliminary, just testing of what a survey like that would look like. So I think that, could be one interesting application.
But it's not just what are most salient, but also what are most tractable right now, right? So like what is it even possible to intervene on right now, given,
This was going to be my point, Helena. I just wanted to add very quickly that it's, we put so much emphasis on what can we do now, but also there could be a lot of harm done if we don't really understand what's going on in the online space. We're quick to assume things like inauthentic coordinated behavior. We're quick to assume misinformation and disinformation could be much more prevalent than how we think. It could be very concentrated in a certain stream of knowledge on one platform from a certain group of influencers. So also because we're going in this direction of also analysis that graduates us into zooming in on the archetypes, I just want to emphasize how important that is. The real study, the review and the scoping. Before the assumption that because there is a certain conflict, then that there will be certain archetypes that are more obvious than others. So that zoom in has been, I think, helpful for us in other places.
Yeah, great. So the next question actually relates to, you mentioned mis and disinformation. So the question is written from Guy Berger is, norms and attitudes bounce off each other and I guess are upstream from knowledge. But where does knowledge, information, and misinformation fit in terms of interacting with norms and attitudes? Just with marginal impact? ? And he is thinking of the classic CAP, KAP model here. So I don't know if you all have thoughts on that.
Can someone remind me what the classic CAP is? That knowledge, attitudes, perceptions? Is that what that is? Yeah, okay.
That's what I was just trying. Yes, I believe so.
Cool. I'm just rereading this.
Yeah, practice it, not perceptions. So behaviors, yeah.
I don't know. I feel like that's a question we would have to take back to. We haven't considered that. Is the answer, guys. So I think we should take that back and think about how it fits into the model. I don't.
It is a great point, right? Because
we do talk about it tangentially.
I think we find ourselves in this conversation without maybe using the same like labels, like semantically, because we see that misinformation and disinformation can be super prevalent and that it cannot be well absorbed into an out group that's already being pulled away. Because of dynamics of affiliation of interest, and I think there needs to be something happening in parallel with the education that we try to combat misinformation with, so that the combative norms that we usually see in these atmospheres don't take over that. I'm thinking of how they bounce off of each other.
I think the other way to think about it, just looking at the guy's next comment about like the situation could be addressed by professional news. I think that there's some of that is true, in the sense that, if only we could make all mis and disinformation go away, then maybe we wouldn't have to be worrying about the archetypes of polarization. But I think we take as a starting point that there will be some actors who will use social media to spread disinformation, and we're interested in how that becomes misinformation. And the way that becomes misinformation has to do with how these archetypes operate. So disinformation would be much less problematic if it didn't go viral, but it does go viral, and it goes viral because of some of the mechanisms that we're describing in these archetypes. So I don't know, I think that would be probably the way we would kind of grapple with that issue of knowledge, because I don't think it's that it's less significant. I think it's that it almost like it seems impossible that just professional news would drown out everything else. And that's what we're trying to describe, why that's the case.
Yeah. And I'd almost put one more, if we could add to our classic cap, TCAP, like I put one more before it, which is trust, which I think is what like a lot of these are founded on. And so even getting, to that knowledge, I immediately went to that affiliation piece, because we know that the knowledge that people trust are dependent on where they're placed in kind of their network public sphere right now. And so like it almost needs a step before that, because there won't just be a generalized knowledge across, if you will. And the other like interesting thing that I hadn't thought about is that with that, with the knowledge, attitudes, practices, it's often interventions are designed based on that, there's a lot of theories of change around, if we change this knowledge, then this attitude will change, then this behavior will change, or if we change this attitude will change, then behavior will change. But there's pretty significant peace building research that says actually change happens in the opposite more reliably, that changing behavior or practices has a bigger effect on changing attitudes or knowledge. And so I think that's just like an interesting thing to think about in terms of engaging with the signal of what interventions you're doing, like what practices can you change that would then influence, those upline things.
Okay, that's a great transit. I mean, the next question asks to go a little bit deeper in the recommendation of engaging the signal, and is asking for clarification of whether this is encouragement to engage with those on social media who are saying hate speech and try to build peace with them, or did I misunderstand this? Otherwise, can you explain further?
Yeah, we do very much mean engaging on social media with those who are saying hate speech. Yes, and it comes with many caveats. One is there may be times when that is unsafe, and there may be people for whom that is unsafe. So we're not saying always or everybody, but we are saying sometimes, and some people can engage directly with hate speech. And this is actually quite, I'd say it comes from a broader practice of peace building and engagement in dialogue, with perpetrators of violence in general. And there's a whole, kind of body of work around how reconciliation happens, and how that often will require engaging with perpetrators of violence. And it's all about how that's done, who does it, and what are the practices that can make for holding a safe space. That's my answer in a nutshell. I mean, yeah. We could keep going. We could do like a whole webinar just on this piece, I feel, but
yeah. Because a lot of that, I mean, like a lot of this is just speaking from personal experiences too, where we've run projects where we are intervening in direct conversations. So I could point you to ours and others, like Institute for Strategic Dialogue had this interesting countering conversations project where they were having direct engagement with those sort of in a radicalization process. Maybe hate speech was a signal used there, I don't know. But that is, direct engagement is one thing that we mean by that. I think another thing that we mean by that too is can be indirect engagement, or can just be using the lessons from that to design other interventions that maybe aren't direct, engaging with one person, but engaging with a group of people. So this is using that signal to find out who's engaging with who, what narratives are they using, who is not engaging with who, and just finding out like where do the conversations and about what need to be taking place. So I think that's another way that you could interpret engaging with the signal as well.
Great. And I see, okay, great. I see Helena has answered the risk question. So we have 4 more minutes. I don't see another question in the chat, so I'll just take the quick prerogative as just a small little question to wrap up. But I mean, I know for this book and for this writing and this work, there are multiple sets of audiences. I think we've talked a lot about the practitioner side, like what types of interventions might you as a practitioner or civil society undertake based on this? I'm wondering also about the sort of more institutional audience, people that are working at large multilaterals or thinking about investing in places that are at risk for conflict, and thinking about what is a comprehensive approach to sort of the types of things you might support or consider if you're investing, whether on conflict or investing in connectivity or whatever it might be. And I'm wondering what, if you could talk a little bit about recommendations for that audience, or what this what this work means is necessary for that audience to take into account or consider.
Yeah, I can do a first stab. I think your term comprehensive would probably like flag a top recommendation that I would have, is that multilateral organizations that have maybe the partnerships and the resources available could use a framework like this to design or to enlist, partners to implement programs that would touch pieces, like all pieces of this. Because I think that's one of our sort of key lessons learned, is that we really can't just focus, any longer on one or two archetypes of like, all of these dynamics of polarization. And so I think, just encouraging more comprehensive approaches and recognizing that, it's probably one organization that can't do all of that, but can we have the type of partnerships or coalitions or like broad-based strategies and priorities that feature sort of all of these elements, so that we are both, addressing norms and, having more opportunities for cross-group interaction, and like addressing real needs and interests, and how can these, like those be brought in conversation with each other. That's one. And the other, like the just second, which is shorter, is just to like take time and invest in the understanding. Mira talked about this a little bit, but just, and I think that goes with comprehensive as well, like just taking time to invest in kind of a more comprehensive analysis, with which we think this could be like, one way of organizing that understanding and that analysis.
Great.
Others? Mira, Helena?
Wonderful. Well, we're at time. Thank you all so much for taking the time to present. And thank you everyone who participated for your questions. Our next presentation will be Kathy Berger from the Dangerous Speech Project. Babak has put a link into the chat, so we'll look forward to seeing many of you there. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.